The city burned. Sarah could barely see through the thick smoke, choking the air, stumbling over crumbling debris. She clutched the strap of her backpack, her heart pounded as the otherworldly moans of the undead grew louder all around her. Just a few days ago, the streets had been filled with people going about their normal lives. Now they lay abandoned, overrun by a horde of mindless, flesh-eating monsters. What had started as isolated reports of a strange illness had rapidly spiraled out of control as the virus spread like wildfire. Sarah pushed on, driven by the primal instinct to survive. She darted down alleyways and sprinted across intersections, always keeping a watchful eye out for the shambling figures that lurked in the shadows. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, the sound of her ragged breathing the only thing she could hear. As she rounded a corner, a group of survivors suddenly materialized out of the gloom. They were armed and on high alert, their weapons raised warily. Sarah froze, unsure if they were friend or foe. The leader, a gruff-looking man with a hardened expression, gestured for her to come closer. "Come with us," the man growled, "if you want to live." Sarah hesitated for a moment, then hurried over to join the group. The survivors moved quickly and quietly, leading her down a maze of streets to a heavily fortified compound. On the surface, it seemed secure, but as Sarah followed them inside, she couldn't help noticing something unsettling about the leader. His neck was partially obscured by the collar of his jacket, but Sarah caught a glimpse of discolored skin and a pattern of angry red marks. As they reached the inner gate, she reached out and gently pushed the collar aside. Her blood ran cold at the sight of the unmistakable bite wounds. The man turned to her, sharply narrowing his eyes. "That was a mistake, little girl," he said in a low voice. Before Sarah could react, he raised his fist and struck her hard, sending her crashing to the ground. The last thing she saw was the horde of undead shambling hungrily towards the open gate. Sarah woke with a pounding headache. Her vision was blurry, and she felt disoriented. As she slowly sat up, glancing around, she realized she was inside the fortified compound, safe behind the sturdy walls. At first she was relieved, but that feeling quickly turned to dread as she noticed that eerie silence. Where was everyone? She got to her feet and cautiously made her way through the deserted hallways, peering into empty rooms. Everything seemed abandoned until she reached the central courtyard. There she found the group of survivors, the ones who had brought her in. They were in a heated argument, their voices low and tense. The leader stood at the center, his expression thunderous as he glared at the others. "You've put all of us in danger," one woman was saying, her voice shaking with fear. "One of us is bitten, and you know it." The leader took a menacing step forward. "Shut your mouth," he snarled. Before the woman could react, he lashed out, grabbing her by the throat and slamming her against the wall. The others cried out in shock, but no one dared to intervene. Sarah watched in horror as the life drained from the woman's eyes. The leader released his grip, and she crumpled limply to the ground. Sarah stared at the body, paralyzed by fear. The leader turned his gaze on her, and she flinched. "You saw what happened," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Now you're going to help us find the infected one before they put us all at risk." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what was happening. The power was failing, and the gates were compromised. Clearly, the group was falling apart from within now. She was trapped inside with a ruthless madman and a deadly horde of undead closing in. With no other choice, she reluctantly agreed to help the remaining survivors search the compound. They split up, scouring every room and hallway for any sign of the hidden infection. Sarah's heart pounded as she checked each dark corner and shadowy alcove. The air was thick with tension and the threat of violence. Sarah knew one wrong move could cost her life. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed through the building, followed by anguished screams. Sarah raced towards the sound and found the survivors clustered in the main hall. One of the men lay bleeding on the floor, another standing over him, his gun still raised. "The infected one was here," the shooter panted, his eyes wild. "This is on all of you." Sarah watched in horror as the chaos unfolded. The survivors were turning on each other, suspicion and fear driving them to violence. She knew she had to find a way out of this nightmare before it was too late, but as she glanced towards the towering gates, she realized with sinking dread that their time was already running out. With the power failing and the compound overrun, Sarah knew they couldn't hold out much longer. The survivors were crumbling under the weight of paranoia and mistrust as they turned on each other in a desperate bid to root out the supposed infected one. Sarah followed the group as they retreated upwards, fighting their way through the dark hallways and stairwells. The undead horde was pressing in relentlessly, their moans and the snarls of the survivors echoing all around them. As they reached the top floor, Sarah lagged behind the others, trying to catch her breath. She was exhausted from the constant running and fighting. Just when she thought she couldn't go any further, the group ahead of her suddenly ground to a halt. Sarah hurried to catch up and froze at the sight before her. The leader had one of the other survivors pinned against the wall, his hands wrapped tightly around the man's throat. The man clawed desperately at the leader's grip, his face contorted in terror. "No, please," the man rasped, but the leader only tightened his hold. Horrified Sarah watched as the life drained from the man's eyes. With a sickening crack, the leader snapped his neck and let the lifeless body crumple to the floor. Sarah stared in stunned silence as the leader turned to the others, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "You see," he growled, his voice dripping with malice, "one of us was the traitor. I've taken care of it." The remaining survivors stared at him in shock and horror. Sarah couldn't believe what she had just witnessed. The leader had murdered one of his own people in cold blood, and now he stood before them with no remorse on his face. As the undead moans grew louder from below, Sarah realized with sinking dread that she was trapped up here with a ruthless madman in charge. She knew she had to find a way out fast before the horde broke through or the leader turned on her next. This was a nightmare with no end in sight. Sarah's mind raced as she stared at the body of the murdered survivor. The leader's words echoed in her head. "One of us was the traitor. I've taken care of it." His callous act had shattered any sense of security or trust within the group. With no power and the compound compromised, the survivors had no choice but to retreat further. Sarah could hear the undead horde growing closer, the snarls and moans filling the air. They had to keep moving. The group hurried up the stairwell, Sarah's legs burning from the strain, but she dared not slow down. As they reached the rooftop, the leader turned to them, his eyes narrowed. "You all stay here and keep watch," he growled. "I'm going to make sure the exits are clear." As he turned to leave, Sarah stepped forward. "What about the traitor?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The leader paused and fixed her with a chilling stare. "The traitor has been dealt with," he said simply. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as the leader disappeared down the stairs. She knew then that he was the infected one, the true traitor all along. But how could she convince the others when he held all the power? Moments later, the leader reappeared, his expression grim. "The exits are blocked," he announced. "The horde is closing in. We're trapped up here." The survivors erupted into panic and confusion. Sarah watched helplessly as they turned on each other once more, the leader standing back, observing it all with a twisted smile. Suddenly, Sarah knew what she had to do. She couldn't stay here any longer, not with the leader ready to turn on her at any moment. Summoning every ounce of her courage, she ran to the edge of the roof and without hesitation leaped off the building. The fall seemed to last an eternity as the wind whipped past her face. Sarah braced herself for the impact, but instead of hitting the ground, she crashed into a mound of rotting bodies, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. As darkness closed in around her, Sarah lay there helpless, surrounded by the undead, her vision blurred and her body ached. But she knew she had to keep moving. Summoning the last of her strength, she forced herself to her feet and stumbled onward, praying she could escape this living nightmare. Sarah's eyes fluttered open. She was lying in a dark, cramped space. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and she could hear the moans of the undead. Nearby, disoriented, she slowly pushed herself up into a sitting position and tried to get her bearings. As her eyes adjusted to the gloom, she realized she was in some kind of tunnel system. The walls were damp and crumbling, and debris littered the ground. Cautiously, she got to her feet, wincing at the pain in her body from the fall. She had no idea where she was, but she knew she couldn't stay here. The zombies would eventually find her. Gripping her backpack tightly, she pressed on down the tunnel, shining her flashlight to illuminate the way. Shadows danced along the walls, and the eerie stillness made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into a vast cavernous space. Sarah stepped out into the chamber, her jaw dropping in shock. The place was enormous, dimly lit by streams of light filtering in from high above crumbling structures, and towering pillars lined the walls, and in the distance she could see the shadowy forms of more tunnels branching off. But what really caught her attention were the creatures that lurked in the gloom. They were not like the shambling zombies she had seen before. These beings moved with unsettling speed and agility. Their bodies contorted and mutated, their razor-sharp claws glinted in the low light, and Sarah could sense a predatory intelligence in their piercing gaze. As she watched one of the creatures turn its head and fix her with an eerie stare, she knew she had to get out of this place fast. But which way should she go? There were tunnels in every direction, and she had no idea what other horrors might be lurking nearby. Gripping her flashlight tightly, Sarah steeled her nerves and pressed on deeper into the cavernous expanse, praying she could find a way to escape this underground nightmare. Sarah crept cautiously through the shadowy cavern, her senses on high alert. At every turn, she encountered the mutated zombies, creatures unlike anything she had seen before. They moved with frightening speed and agility, their deformed bodies contorted and covered in jagged protrusions. As she picked her way through the maze-like tunnels, she could feel their predatory gazes following her. Every so often, one would emerge from the darkness, its hollow eyes locked onto her, its razor-sharp claws glinting menacingly. Sarah's heart raced as she desperately tried to avoid drawing their attention. Exhausted and wounded from her previous ordeal, she knew she couldn't keep this up much longer. The mutant zombies seemed to be toying with her, herding her deeper into their lair. Sarah strained her ears, listening for any sign of an exit or a potential escape route, but the cavern was eerily silent save for the occasional low growl. Just when she felt like she couldn't go any further, Sarah spotted a small alcove up ahead, offering a possible refuge. She hurried towards it, shining her flashlight inside to ensure it was empty. Then, with a mixture of relief and trepidation, she slipped inside and collapsed against the wall. For a time, all was still, the only sound her own ragged breathing as she tried to catch her breath. Suddenly, a movement in the shadows made her freeze, a chill running down her spine. She held her breath, peering intently into the darkness, and that's when she saw them. Two glowing eyes staring back at her from the corner. Sarah stifled a gasp, realizing with dread that she was not alone in this alcove. Something else was lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. She gripped her flashlight tightly, ready to strike, but knowing deep down that she was now trapped with an unknown horror that could strike at any moment. Sarah held her breath as the glowing eyes fixed her with an unsettling gaze. Her heart pounded in her chest as she tried to make out the shape of the creature in the darkness. Slowly it began to move, creeping closer, its hulking form emerging from the shadows. Sarah tensed, ready to swing her flashlight as a weapon, but then the creature froze, suddenly distracted by a distant sound. Its ears perked up, and it turned its massive head, sniffing the air. Sarah watched in bewilderment as it lumbered away, disappearing back into the gloom. Seizing the opportunity, Sarah peered cautiously out of the alcove. The cavern was eerily silent save for the faint sounds of movement in the distance. Gripping her flashlight tightly, she crept out of her hiding spot and made her way towards the source of the sound. As she drew closer, she could make out the shapes of several figures moving through the cavern. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized they were human survivors armed with weapons and tactical gear. They appeared to be searching for something, carefully navigating the treacherous terrain. Summoning her courage, Sarah called out to them, hoping they might be friendly. The survivors instantly whirled around, weapons raised. Their leader, a grizzled man with a hard expression, fixed her with a cold glare. "You shouldn't be down here," the man barked, his finger tightening on the trigger. Sarah raised her hands placatingly. "I mean you no harm," she said quickly. "I just want to get out of here. Can you help me?" The leader's eyes narrowed as he considered her for a moment. Then, without warning, he raised his rifle and opened fire. Sarah's heart nearly stopped as the gunshots echoed through the cavernous space. She flung herself backwards, just narrowly avoiding the hail of bullets that whizzed past her. Crouching behind a massive pillar, she cried out in pain as one of the rounds grazed her arm. The scavenger survivors were unrelenting, peppering her hiding spot with a barrage of fire. Sarah knew she couldn't stay here. The cavern was a death trap. With nowhere to run, she desperately searched for another way out, but the only option seemed to be venturing deeper into the lair of the mutant zombies. Gritting her teeth against the searing pain in her arm, Sarah steeled her nerves and made a break for it, sprinting as fast as she could. She ducked and weaved between the towering pillars, the scavenger's gunfire chasing her every step of the way. Just as she reached the edge of the chamber, a tremendous roar echoed through the darkness. Sarah froze in her tracks, her blood turning to ice as a massive shape emerged from the shadows. The scavengers also paused their assault, staring in stunned silence at the horrifying creature that now blocked their path. It was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen. A towering humanoid monstrosity with twisted limbs and jagged spines protruding from its body, glowing red eyes fixed them with a predatory gaze, and it let out another earth-shaking bellow that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cavern. Sarah watched in frozen horror as the scavengers opened fire, their bullets seemingly having little effect on the hulking behemoth. It advanced on them with terrifying speed, its long claws slashing and tearing. The scavengers screamed in terror as they were ruthlessly cut down one by one. Trapped and with no means of escape, Sarah clutched her last grenade, praying it would be enough to stop this unstoppable horror. But just as she pulled the pin, she heard a bone-chilling realization. The monstrous creature was not the only threat she faced down here. The cavern was teeming with the mutant zombies, and they were rapidly closing in all around her.